Hello and welcome to the latest Q&A in Screen International's For Your Consideration series. I'm Screens America's editor, Jeremy Kay, and today I'm delighted to be joined by the filmmaking team behind Flee, director-producer Jonas Poher Rasmussen. Hi, Jonas.
Hey.
And his producers, Signe Byrge Sørensen. Hi, Signe.
Hi. Hi.
And Charlotte De La Gournerie. Hi, Charlotte.
Hi.
So, a little intro on the film. Flee, first of all, bears the distinction of being the first feature to be nominated for the animation, documentary, and international feature film Oscars. That's the first time that's happened. It was a Cannes 2020 label selection, premiered in Sundance 2021, where it won the World Cinema Documentary Grand Jury Prize. The story centers on Amin Nawabi, not his real name, who, living in Denmark and on the verge of marriage to his soon-to-be husband, recalls his past life to his longtime friend Jonas, telling how he fled his native Afghanistan under the Mujahideen rule in the 1990s with his family, and endured a grueling and terrifying journey via Russia that finally saw him arrive in Denmark. Flee has earned accolades around the world. It won 4 awards, including Best Documentary at last month's Danish Film Academy Robert Awards. It's nominated for 2 Baftas and is up for editing at the Eddies this weekend, and also Best Documentary at this weekend's Film Independent Spirit Awards. It's released in the United States by Neon and Participant. So welcome, guys, to today's Q&A. Thank you for taking part. And Jonas, really, first to you, if I may, tell us about the long process in getting the story of your high school friend Amin onto the screen.
Well, I guess it really started, when I met him 15 years ago, because that's kind of where the curiosity started. I grew up in this small Danish rural village, and one day he showed up all by himself from Afghanistan and stayed in foster care with a family just around the corner from where I lived. And I was curious about how and why he came, but he didn't want to talk about it. And I, of course, respected that. But, my curiosity was there. And this story of his past kind of became this secret and this kind of black box, both in our friendship, but also within him, that he didn't want to open. And then 9 years ago, he decided that he would like to share his story, that he would like to open this black box and do it to me. And then we could animate the whole thing. I had before asked him if I could do a radio documentary about his story, and he felt that it was something he needed to do, but he didn't feel quite ready. But the fact that we could do it as an animated film was really what enabled him to start opening up, because he could be anonymous behind the animation. And what you hear in the film and what you see is the very first time he talks about these very kind of traumatic experiences he went through, fleeing Afghanistan and going to Denmark. And it's not easy for him to talk about. So the fact that he could be anonymous and didn't have to be in the public eye about these things, and could still keep control over when he wanted to talk about these things, was really what enabled him to start sharing his story. And that's what then became Flee.
Yeah, thank you. And obviously we want to talk quite a bit about the animation itself, but tell me also about your interviewing technique, where it's actually lying down and eyes closed and he's talking. How did you evolve that? How did that come about?
Well, that really comes from my background in radio. We have a quite strong tradition in radio documentary in Denmark. And this technique of interviewing is something I learned when I started doing radio. It's called, in Danish, it's called moment interview, which means like interview of the moment. And it's really about creating presence in the way people talk. Because when you work in radio, of course, you don't have an image. So you need your subject to be really descriptive in their way of talking. So by having him lay down and having his eyes closed and talk present tense, it's really about getting him back to the memories, getting him inside the memories. So you always start out with kind of asking him about the location. When he starts talking about a specific memory, I ask him to start out describing the location in detail, which gave us a lot of details for the animators to kind of work from. But also, it would bring him back to the specific situations, and he would start to recall things he had otherwise forgotten, and he would kind of relive these things instead of just retelling them. And I know it looks kind of like a therapeutical situation, it wasn't thought as that, but during the very first interview, Amin said this is going to be therapeutic for me. So it also became that, because it's also about him unburdening himself.
And I read in an interview in Screen, actually, that you, how can I say it? You sort of say that you're not yourself a particularly accomplished animator, but there's something so tell me a bit about the process then of bringing on animators, and maybe Signe and Charlotte can talk a little bit about this too.
Yes, no, but this is the very first animated film I've done, and I can't draw, so it would be a very surreal experience if I had to animate this myself. But because it's a story that takes place in the past, we always in documentary struggle with how do we make it feel alive again? How do we make it feel current? And with the animation, it really enabled us to to revitalize his past, revitalize Afghanistan in the 80s and Moscow in the 90s and his childhood home, and to place him there. But also, of course, because he wanted to be anonymous. There wasn't really any way around it. We needed to do something to kind of keep him anonymous. And then also because it's really a story about memory and trauma as well. With the animation, it enabled us to be a lot more expressive and be somewhat more. It felt like we could be somewhat more honest towards his emotions when he started to talk about things, his traumas, things that's really difficult for him to talk about. We could go into this more kind of surreal layer that kind of represents his emotions, when he is inside the traumas.
Yes, and a long process to bring this to the screen, and I imagine the interviewing process took a while too. Signe and Charlotte, I just would like to ask you now, tell me a bit about putting the project together, because I know it's a very European film, isn't it?
Yeah, maybe I can say something about the finance. It was also Monica Hellström, the third producer on the film, who were very much part of that. And it's basically a European co-production. So Denmark is the main country, but then there's France and Sweden and Norway as well. And it actually, in many ways, it's a very expensive documentary film, but a very cheap animated film. And that means that we went to all the usual suspects in the documentary world in Europe, the public service TV stations and the film institutes and so on. But they also had to go out of their ways and give more money than normal for a documentary film. And still, that it was tough to get the finance together for something like this with this kind of ambition. But we were very lucky to get some great partners on board, and also that, for example, the Danish Film Institute stretched they kind of invented a new fund, you could say, for very ambitious documentary films. So this became possible. And we also got BIFAs on board here in the US at the end to close the finance. So it's a project with a lot of partners. It's one that has one of these very huge finance plans with many partners on board. And yes, Monica and I come from Final Cut for Real, and we have mainly done documentaries. And so we also, like Jonas, we can't draw, and we hadn't done animation in this at this level before. So we very much relied on Sun Creature and Charlotte and all the animators that she could bring into this whole project in order to make it work.
Yes, thank you. And Charlotte, I'd love to just bring you in on this question too then, and your role, how you help bring this to the screen.
Yeah, I wanted to add to what Signe was saying. It's also very brave financiers, because doing an animated documentary is not very common and it's quite rare. So thanks that Ari Folman did Vals with Bashir a few years back, because that was like a talking point to financiers that can, when we were going to them and asking for financing, we need some reference point, because it's often like, but why are you sure it's going to work? And I think the financiers that we've met have been very brave to go on a project like that, because animation for grown up and talking about Afghan gay refugee, that was like 7-8 years ago, where the refugee crisis was quite strong in Europe, and it still is. So yeah, I just wanted to mention that as well. And I also want to mention that, you know, the partnership on this movie from the producer is very special, because Monica and Signe from Final Cut, they're very strong within documentary. You know, they with being Oscar nominated for the Act of Killing and The Look of Silence. And Signe was saying it's their first animated feature, but it is my first animated feature as well, in Sun Creature. So it's also, you know, partners that come on board really because of the story from Amin that Jonas is carrying, and people around the project, both from like an artistic point of view and financiers, we were really there to try to respect the story, and we need to make to bring the right people around the table. And I think people coming from a documentary background and animation background, and to serve that story, because we don't work the same way. It's not the same pipeline, it's not the same software, it's not the same talents that you bring on. It's not the same as budget, as Signe mentioned. So it requires the people that works on the project requires for people to like put a bit on the side what they usually know, to go into something that they think could be special. And I think I started like on the project 7 years ago maybe, and I think every people that I've met through the project came into the project with that mindset. And I think you can see that in the film, and I think that's where the movie has been picked up by the documentary crowd and the animation crowd. You know, that's mean that it's recognized by both category, like not category, but only also pairs, you know, like people from and I think that means that it means that both the documentary and the animation has been recognized as a craft, and I think it's yeah.
Well, you know, it's so interesting what you're saying, because you've made something new, and it just that shows on the screen just an extraordinary vision that we haven't seen before. And I wanted to ask you a little bit, Jonas, about some of your creative choices. There's jump cuts, which we don't often see in animation, and then there's these wonderful expressive passages, and then of course the archival footage as well. Just tell us about those decisions, using those forms to tell this story.
Well, you know, it really comes from the testimony and from the documentary recordings beneath everything. So because it's an animated documentary, we wanted to keep these, you know, documentary traits in there, you know, so that sometimes you have jump cuts, and sometimes you have that, you know, the image is a little out of focus, or the camera is moving a little bit. Having these things in there to kind of remind people that, okay, but yes, it's animation, but underneath the whole thing is a true story. It's a true human being telling it, that it's testimony underneath everything. So we want to keep these things in there to kind of, you know, so people felt in the backbone, okay, but yeah, it is animation, but it's also true. And then, you know, the rest of it really came from the way he talked about things, so trying to listen carefully to how he spoke about things and keeping the authenticity. And you know, try to make sure that Afghanistan in the 80s felt like Afghanistan in the 80s. Spending a lot of time, you know, going to libraries, finding books with pictures of Afghanistan in the 80s, finding archival footage from Afghanistan in the 80s. And we would then use some of that archival footage, but also sometimes, you know, we would just pick and choose designs and props and redraw it and put it into the animation, so it felt like it belonged to the same world. So really just having these different elements in there, so it felt natural that this is a documentary and it's animation and it makes sense. And then, as I mentioned before, you know, these sequences, when he starts talking about his traumas, you could sense in his voice that, you know, that his voice changed when he started to talk about these things that it's really difficult for him to talk about. You could sense that he would slow down, he would lose some words, sometimes he would even stop, and especially, you know, on the video, because everything was shot in video as well, and you could see on the video material that now he was inside an emotion. You know, now it wasn't about what things looked like, what happened. It was about a feeling he had inside. And I thought, okay, we need to see this feeling and try to be honest to what is going on right now, which is that now he's inside something very unpleasant. He's inside something that makes him really afraid or angry or sad. And try to use the tool of animation to support that and be honest to these emotions.
Yeah, and as I think it's been said already in this interview, you know, the film encompasses so many elements, the notion of belonging, refugee experience, violence against women, homosexuality. I wondered, did you have a clear entry point into telling this story when you were thinking about making the film?
But it really comes from, like, going back to that bus stop in my childhood when I met him. You know, it really comes from the friendship and being fundamentally curious about his story. I never really thought, okay, I want to do a story about a refugee or about someone, a gay coming out story. You know, I didn't think it really came from a fundamental curiosity about my friend. And to me, this is a story about friendship as well. It's a story about secrets, about keeping secrets, and what it does to you to keep secrets. And I think, to me, that's more where it started. And then these other stories kind of came along, and you know, and also it kind of evolved in the process. We started out in 2013, where it really was, you know, me being curious about his story, and then the refugee crisis hit in 15, which changed my perspective a little, and I felt more of a need to give a human face to these stories, because I was hoping, because this is a story that's told from the inside of this friendship, that I could give something else, give some perspective to it. So it's really a project that kind of grew in the process. And, you know, we started out just a conversation between me and him in my living room like 9 years ago. And here we are 9 years after with 3 nominations, which is just crazy to me. But it's been a project that really just grew and grew and grew.
Wow, it's extraordinary. And Signe and Charlotte, you know, as producers and of clearly you've been so supportive, you are essential to the making of this film. What were it's such an unusual approach. What were some of your concerns in making this?
I think, I mean, it was a huge learning process along the way. And I remember especially having to learn to read an animatic, right? Because normally we see a lot of footage as documentary producers, and we work with the directors and the editors and shape that. But before that process of editing, there's been a whole process of defining what is this project about, and going shooting often several times, and so that we know a process where a story is shaped like that. But here we had Jonas's interviews and everything he knew from Amin, and Jonas was working with storyboard artists who were drawing the story, but there were several people drawing, and they were drawing Amin in slightly different ways, and it was very rough drawings at this point, right? And then Jonas and Janus, the editor, were editing them together. And that meant that when we were seeing rough cuts, various versions of rough cuts, they were really, really rough in a way that I wasn't used to. And learning to make the story work with your inside your head on the basis of those drawings and the sound alone was a learning process. But it was fantastic once it sort of really we got there, and we felt that now the story is holding together. And then the actual production of the animation happens afterwards, because we could never have done it the other way around, right? Because we couldn't afford to animate 200 hours and then start editing. That would never work. So this has to be the way, and it's a very beautiful way, actually, I think. But it was a roundabout process for me, for sure.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Charlotte, I'd love to bring you in as well with your observations on what you've learned and making this.
Yeah. It took us about 5 years, I think, to put the financing together. And I think it's, I've learned that time, can be frustrating, but it can be good for a process. And I think it was very beneficial for us. I think mixing, like having people working on the film coming from live action, documentary and animation made the film more interesting than if we only stayed with animation crew. I think it's I think in my next movie, I would like to have people coming from live action and documentary. I think we have a different approach to how to tell a story, starting from a script, really, because when you read a script, someone who doesn't know animation, there's something that happens visually. So you have a question: when do you stop writing and when do you start storyboarding? And I think, because at some point there's something you can see but you can't write, and the other way around. And the editing is very interesting. I think it's Jonas Poher has done an amazing job, and I think it's quite unique to see in an animation movie an editing, such a strong editing with all those back and forth. It's because the movie is quite challenging for the audience. You have different style of animation, so you have the graphical sequences, you have the classic 2D, and you have the archive footage. So that's already three lecture, and then you have the present time, and then the past, past time of a different time, different ages, and then you have those cuts where you go to like Afghanistan, Russia, Estonia, Denmark. So it's a lot to proceed in it's an hour and a half movie, and I think Janus. The work he's done with Jonas on the edits, I think it's been a very big learning, just to watch them working. I think and see the different cut outcomes, and also like during the production of this storyboard and animatic, we were doing like some screening where we with Signe and Monica and Jonas asked some people from the industry that they knew to come and to watch the animatic in rough cut and come with comments. And I think that's very interesting, because if you choose like the people, like if you choose the people to, you can choose people that you like to work with, and I think it's very valuable to get their inputs. I think all that, I think it's very collaborative. It's really about the movie and the story, and you put away the ego of like, oh, I know better because I've done it before. I think it's, and I don't know if it's because Denmark is like very collaborative in the way we were like. It's a cultural thing, maybe. I thought so because I'm French, but it was the first time for me that I've worked like that. But it's also my first feature, so it's a lot of first time. So it's very hard to compare. But I think it's this collaborative way of working. I think it's really it's been a big experience for me, and for the animation team, I know as well.
Yes, good. And Jonas, just we've got the last few minutes. I wanted to ask you, incredibly brave of Amin to be doing this. And once you started the interviews, was he committed to it, or were there some moments when he felt, I need a break, I can't, we need to stop for a while, some days, weeks? How did that go?
But it took a long time to do all these interviews. I've done, I think, 20 interviews with him during a span of 4 or 5 years. Yeah. And in the beginning, the agreement was really that we were just trying it out. He was concerned in the beginning if he would be able to do it. So we kind of agreed, okay, but the first year or so, we would do interviews, and he would then kind of see how it felt, if it felt okay. And he could always kind of walk out if it didn't feel right, and we would make the film. So it was super important for me in the beginning to make him feel comfortable and make sure that that we didn't force anything on him. And then, of course, when we started to get funding, we had to look each other in the eyes, and he said, but this feels, not only does it feel okay, it feels good to be able to get my story out there. So it was, but it was a very slow process of kind of going deeper and deeper to this memory. So in the beginning, he would say at times, okay, but I'm not ready to talk about this. And then we would leave it, and then a year or two later, he would be ready to talk about it. Wow. And sometimes we would revisit memories. I would, had done an interview about a certain memory. And then I would listen to it, and new questions would pop up. And I would ask, can we go back and revisit this memory? And then we say, okay. So it feels like, in the beginning, I kind of got the broad strokes. And then from there, it was really about going deeper and deeper into these memories, because it was also about me kind of getting more and more curious and having new questions pop up, and him being more and more ready to share things. And also, as he started, opening up this black box, new things would come up, new things he had forgotten would come up. So it was a slow process of really going deeper and deeper into this testimony.
Jonas, Signe, Charlotte, thank you so much for your time. Congratulations on making an extraordinary piece of work. We wish you all the best with it. And that's all we have time for in today's Q&A. But thank you to the audience for watching. And for more information about the series, visit screendaily.com/FYC-screenings. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. It's a pleasure talking to you. I wish you all the best this weekend and with the rest of the award season.
Thank
Thank
you
you very
Thanks
much.
a lot. Thanks for doing it.
Thank you to you. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.